Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Totalbiscuit, and bringing you another interview with BioWare as regards to the Old Republic. You seem to enjoy the last one, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you a man you've heard from before. His surname is one that I am always very terrified of, because it seems like the kind of thing that I would screw up, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. It is the lead game designer from BioWare. It is Gabe Amantangelo. Welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here. You almost had it. It's
almost had it.
Almost had it. Amantangelo or Amantangelo.
Absolutely. I could just call you Gabe, but it turns out that Gabe is a very popular name in the games industry.
Yeah. Not growing up, but it seems it's more contemporary nowadays. You hear it a lot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you're in good company when it comes to the various Gabes in the game industry. At the moment, they are well regarded. Right, so let's talk Old Republic, and let's get into detail on a number of things. First things first, I just want to get your general impressions up to this point, because needless to say, we are just over a month in now to the Old Republic, and this is BioWare's first attempt at an MMO. So,
yeah,
considering your fairly vital role in the company, I'd like to hear your general impressions of how you feel things are going so far.
Well, I mean, I think it's going really well. Obviously, there's some things we're working on, like bug fixes, polishing, etc., and some fine tuning, particularly at the endgame stuff. Story is a very, very core component to the BioWare infrastructure, and I think we've delivered really well on that stuff. Players, enjoying the different choices and options as leveling up. And of course, we surveyed the different flashpoints and what flashpoints were popular, and we're releasing new flashpoints that are very story centric, as players are enjoying that quite a bit. And the feedback on the recent flashpoint released, K-On!, seems to be going really well.
That's good to hear, actually. I'd like to have a couple of words about flashpoints, in fact, because
sure,
we were looking through the flashpoints that we've played through so far, and we were discussing this on our podcast, and we all came to the conclusion that the Black Talon was an extremely good introductory flashpoint. However, some of the other flashpoints, such as Hammer Station, weren't so story-orientated. Do you think that there's any chance that BioWare will actually revisit and make changes to those flashpoints, or would you prefer to simply release new flashpoints so that people have a greater variety to try out?
The latter is probably, more likely. It's what's on our plate now. We are creating new flashpoints. K-On! Was the first part of a two-part sort of story arc, so we're working on the second part on that right now. Total right now is 16 flashpoints, and 10 of those flashpoints are the full story, much like Black Talon. 6 of them being sort of lighter, but we injected some of the old school type of RPG, or homage to it rather, mechanics. Like you can discover hidden pathways, like levers, etc., things like that. So it's very RPG centric, just not as much dialogue and story choices in those. Now, there is the player base who do prefer that, so it's sort of why we have the spread there. It probably would have been more ideal if we almost had it every other, instead of going with Black Talon, and then you have Hammer Station and Aethys, and then Mandalorian Raiders, which are the lighter sort of story ones, and then you jump back into the I was about to say a spoiler, but I'm not going to say a spoiler.
Yeah,
so the
careful.
Terror 5s, because if you've played it, you know what I'm talking about. But the
Yes,
Terror 5 and Maelstrom Prison, and those sort of 4 flashpoints there. Hindsight, it probably would have been better to do in every other, so the players know that there is, like, the majority of them are the very story centric, but there's a few that are not.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from there when it comes to spacing out the content and the expectations of players, because I feel that, say, the Black Talon set people up for thinking, well, this is a different kind of dungeoneering, I suppose, with a more story-orientated aspect to it, and then they ran into a few where that wasn't happening. But it's good to hear your thoughts on that nonetheless. And there's another thing I'd like to say on the subject of flashpoints. Needless to say, when I talked to you at Gamescom, you were having to be a little bit cautious about talking about various difficulty levels. Now, of course, we know that there is the harder difficulty mode available for those who are maxed out in level. Now, I have to imagine that there's a little bit of difficulty when it comes to balancing, from a design perspective, the idea of repeatedly running dungeons with the idea that you're also trying to tell a story. Do you feel that repetition dilutes the storytelling and role-playing elements down to the point where, after you've done it a few times, it doesn't really matter anymore?
Well, I mean, it's like spoiler when you know the end of the story, you know the end of the story. But in a lot of these cases, we have different, different options, different choices that can be made, so you can see it unfold a little bit differently. Also, your company, like the players you're playing with, will change how it unfolds, and sort of just the reactions, and you can see how the different classes react, and some of their references to the old stories or to their sort of class stories within their dialogue and things like that to kind of spice it up. But ultimately, it comes down to the gameplay, right? I mean, the gameplay is what is the core at repeatability. Like, as long as the gameplay is interesting and it's fun and it's dynamic, I think the two components, the story component and the gameplay together, I think is a good complement and will sort of serve those needs. I also think there's a certain player base that is very kind of casually oriented, and having that very sort of lucid story like front and center helps get them through and see what they're doing and what's the context and the contextualization of the action. So it really enriches the experience for that player base as well.
Yeah, I did notice that providing context to actions is one of the strong points of the game, because there have been, needless to say, a lot of criticisms leveled at the Old Republic in the sense that, well, this questing is very similar to questing that we've seen in previous games, and I no doubt you're getting sick of hearing the WoW comparisons at this point, but needless to say, it's going to happen one way or the other. But MMO questing in general, in terms of its mechanics, hasn't really evolved all that much over the past decade, but as you just pointed out, providing context to actions can make things which are otherwise a little more mundane, I suppose, feel like they matter a little bit more. And I assume that that was something that was core to the design of the game.
Yeah, certainly. And I think companions also add another element to just the questing and the adventuring, another level of sort of depth with it. And then the individual class designs and sort of just the the immersiveness of the Star Wars kind of fantasy with the different roles of the different classes, from smuggler to Sith warriors, etc., and how that affects the combat. And also there's the element, like one of the different, like you're right, like we have evolutionized but didn't revolutionize, and that's sort of the phrase that I think James Olin uses, but heroic combat. So it's like, it's not all about just like, attacking that boar for 60 seconds before it goes down, and instead we try to focus on, it's like, okay, there's 3 dudes, and the sort of the TTK, as we call it, like the time to kill a certain encounter, is spread amongst the 3, but it feels a lot more heroic in the combat.
Yeah, of course.
Without questing.
Yeah, so you're dealing with multiple abilities coming from different kinds of mobs and things like that, which does make it feel a little bit better. I think everyone that I've spoken to, including myself, has always had immersion problems with Star Wars games when a lightsaber is treated as a wiffle bat.
Yeah.
That's certainly an issue there. But yeah, I think that's going to apply to pretty much any MMO game. You can't simply kill everything in an instant.
Exactly. It's tough. It's like, you can't, when you stab a person with a lightsaber, you can't make them initially die all the time. So that's tough. It's tough to deal with that.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be, honestly. Was that something that came up in the design process, and you simply decided that there really isn't an easy solution to this, and people are just going to have to suspend their disbelief somewhat?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, short of completely revolutionizing the combat system, which would probably have alienated a big player base, I mean, some people are interested in the revolutionize, but we opted not to go with completely changing how combat works in that regard.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot to concern yourself with as well, considering the legacy of Knights of the Old Republic, and then that had the same kind of problem. While it did have quite a dynamic, locked-in combat system whereby parries and thrusts were actually done between the characters, there were times when you still hit an unarmored guy with a lightsaber and he didn't seem to care. So I think that there are a degree of expectations of your older fan base that you do still have to appeal to there. So,
sure.
Well, you have my sympathies. Let me put it that way. Trying to actually keep people happy in that regard, but you've done a fairly reasonable job so far. Right, now let's talk about specifics, shall we? Because there are a number of, say, current affairs issues that I think my subscribers would strangle me for if I didn't address. So we're going to talk about something which interests me quite a bit, having had a fairly long time playing MMOs, and that's the idea of PvP balance affecting PvE and vice versa. Now, a specific example would be some changes to the operative. For instance, the abilities Acid Blade, Jarring Strike and Hidden Strike, and I believe Hidden Strike, for instance, the damage output of that ability was decreased by approximately 20% to control burst damage in PvP, since it was killing people a little bit too fast. So the straight-up question is, how do you balance between PvP and PvE without one negatively affecting the other, bearing in mind that previous MMOs of prominence have fallen into this trap?
Sure, no, there's no doubt it's a challenge. As far as the PvP team's sort of involvement with the class balance and stuff is, we do a scoring, an ability scoring system and an overall class scoring system, and we hand that off to Georg Zoller and his crew, and they put their abilities through it. Now with the volume of stuff, especially leading up to launch, it's like some of the abilities weren't scored exactly correctly, or some of the data was missed. And so we're fixing some of those things, and this change actually involves that. It was scored too high relative to to the sort of the mean of the different classes overall. Now, things that affect the score of an individual ability are modifiers like, does it require a setup, does it require stealth, those types of things. And of course you get bonuses when it requires setups, so then you'll see higher damages. But this one did go over and above because it did not apply those modifiers correctly, if you will. Now, as far as it affecting PvE, if it's within these targets, it should not affect PvE. It should be within the targets of PvE. But again, so many different variables. We'll continue to monitor and see if we do need to make changes, and we will make changes.
Excellent. It's good to hear that was actually kind of a correction as opposed to
a
balance issue.
Yeah.
But I suppose you're going to end up running into these the further into the game you go, and balance is always a consistent challenge that developers have to deal with.
Sure.
So I would have to ask, bearing in mind that other developers have shied away from this, would it be something that BioWare would consider further down the line to make changes to certain abilities so that they function differently in PvP than they do in PvE?
I mean, it's one of those sort of last
last resort kind of thing.
Yeah, last resort. I mean, we like to keep it this consistent behavior between. I mean, players who are playing, they'll see there are a few abilities, like 2 or 3 per class that are PvE exclusive. And then guard and taunt have different functions in PvP than PvE, and that's just inherent to okay, players don't have AI, so obviously
system,
yeah. So it's a last resort. I mean, we try to keep it consistent across the board, just for the sort of sanctity of the gameplay overall. If it needs to, we will, but we think we can handle between the two, and when we can't, we'll address that individually.
Fair enough. Now, when it comes to PvP, when the game first launched, it was effectively bracketless. Now, those of you listening to this who know quite a bit about MMOs are probably also aware that many MMOs have chosen a bracket-based PvP whereby there are, say, 10 levels in which you compete, and then, say, a level 10 will go in with up to level 19 and so on and so forth. Now, there wasn't really a lot of that on launch, but I am hearing murmurings that you're considering adding more brackets. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, no, so the matchmaking system was using a sorting method and sorting people, but if there were not people of a certain level sort of range, then over time it would expand that and allow more in. Now, the level 50 bracket was necessary because of the endgame itemization progression going beyond Bolster, what Bolster would do. So we had to do that. And it's something we wanted to do. We wanted to do for some time, and we got it in on the 1.1 patch, fortunately. As far as further bracketing, we would not go to further bracketing without sort of opening up the sort of pools of players. And I guess you can infer what you will from there with that.
I think people are smart enough to figure that out.
Yeah. So we wouldn't go beyond that. Obviously, we'll continue to refine the matchmaking logic, but having regular pops is a desire, and we're working towards ensuring that across all different types of server populations. Again, inferring what you will.
Indeed. Server populations is an issue that's come up, and it seems that, from what I can tell, more people have actually decided to roll Empire than have rolled Republic. That is causing issues. So,
right.
I suppose the question would be, how does BioWare attempt to address that or indeed do they do so at all?
Well, I guess one good way to sort of backstory it, if you will, you know, the game is story. You know, it's story centric, story 1st and foremost. And I don't think that we wanted to have, or you know, I guess above my pay grade, wanted to have limitations on what stories players could experience on whatever server they're playing on.
Yeah.
So how do we handle it going forward? I mean, there are the obvious sort of design ways to handle it. With incentives and things like that, and all these things are in discussion. There's also, you know, I mean, I'm not even sure exactly what I could say on that topic because it's sort of it's not in my purview of exactly what I'm doing. But I mean, there are things to encourage rolling other factions, etc., to sort of to balance that stuff out, and we're working on those things. I guess that's as much as I'm cleared to say at the moment.
Fair enough. At least it is on the minds, and I suppose that the reason
very much so.
Yeah, the reason that was asked was primarily due to Ilum, which has been causing all sorts of issues lately. And those of you who don't know what Ilum is, it's basically an open-world PvP planet, and populations can cause problems when you go into that kind of setup.
Sure, it's the nature of the beast with open-world PvP, right? If you don't have sort of faction, and particularly with two factions, if you don't have the faction balances, obviously open world PvP is going to
run into problems.
Yeah, you'll run into problems. There's a number of things we want to do with Ilum, and I put on a previous blog post, and some of those things involve, you know, obviously keeping factions balanced within that area at least, if not on the server. And those things just aren't in yet, but it is very much on the mindset, and it's not like it's like, oh, we didn't think about this when going into it. It's like we thought about it, and it's like it's what we want to do. It's just a matter of it's a very big game, and we're getting to it. We're getting to that stuff. And then of course we wanted to make sure everyone was safe to enter and exit Ilum at their leisure if they did encounter that stuff. And of course, quickly we reacted to a bug that prevented that. But overall, it's an opt-in type thing is the idea, especially until we can get the balance within that particular area solid across. Now, of course, on certain servers, it's already like that. You know, there already is that faction balance there, and there's a lot of healthy activity with it. But going forward, it's very much on the mindset, very much in the forefront, and you know, we know that's something we want to address.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Endgame in terms of the larger operations. Now, you did recently bring in more Endgame content, which is something that people initially asked for, and I always feel that the expectation of players when going into new MMO is that it'll have some massive, fully fledged Endgame with as many raids as other popular MMOs, but they don't seem to realize the development time of that, and that other MMOs have been around for 5-6 years making that content. So I'm certainly not going to shout at you guys to a lack of that, but what I would like to talk about when it comes to operations is something a bit more specific. The idea of the UI and the potential for modification. Now, I noticed in the recent What's Coming Up video that you guys put up on your website that you're going to be offering some UI customization inside the UI itself, just natively in the game, which is fantastic, so people can move things around there. But the issue keeps coming up, and in previous interviews I've heard the terms possibly looking into it, thinking about it, when it comes to the idea of actual UI modification. And that, as kind of an old school raider, someone that did this for years, the risk that I see and the development that I've seen of modifications in other games has led to a situation where creating interesting and balanced encounters is difficult because players come to rely too much on a set of UI modifications that remove elements of skill and coordination, one might say, from the actual game. Now, for someone that obviously oversees the design of operations, is very much involved in that, I would definitely like to hear your thoughts on mods in general and how they affect the design of endgame raid encounters.
Well, I mean, certainly, if you have the option to have the mods and sort of how the breadth and the depth of the mods that you allow will affect the gameplay. And so if you're going to rely on things like threat meters and stuff like that, well, then the mechanics can have more sort of threat switching and manipulation with the threat meters, assuming that players are looking at and monitoring those things. I mean, I personally don't prefer that stuff. I prefer it to be more contextualized. I mean, in the vein of many elements within the game, I like contextualizing things. And the directive I've given to my teams, particularly, knowing that we weren't going to have those mods in there, was make sure that everything is telegraphed. Now, hundreds of boss fights, has that directive been to the fullest and perfection? No, but it still maintains that is the direction, and we will be fixing those things and correcting those things. But a lot of things, like within Karaga's Palace, you can see the latest one, we do a lot of like center screen messages, just telegraphing with animations, etc. So I think it's more fun to have it in the game world instead of on the interface. But that's not to say that we're not going to allow interface mods to happen. That's not specifically my department. Obviously, it does affect my department, but that would be like a James Olin, Damian Schubert type thing.
Yeah, so it's always on your mind, I suppose, and no doubt in a future interview we'll ask as to whether or not there'll be any restrictions in that if you decide to allow it.
Sure, yeah.
Now, just one little specific thing here, which does, I suppose, have wider implications, because it's a problem that a lot of MMOs have had to deal with when it comes to the end game. And it's the idea that certain professions, crafting abilities, and so forth become essential for those who want to get involved in the high-end PvE. And specifically, we're talking about the crew skill biochem in this regard. So, biochem, for those who don't know, allows, needless to say, biochemistry. It also allows the creation of unique and powerful reusable biochem-only stims. Now, what people are saying at the moment is that this means biochem is essential. You cannot go into endgame raiding without biochem. So how would you respond to that?
Well, in the 1.1, we brought down some of the power levels on those things. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, an ability scoring type thing. It really comes down to some of those items just need to be corrected. Now, as far as crafting goes, overall, the direction for the endgame thing is to have every crafter have sort of a equal advantage in endgame content. Has that target been hit across the board? No. Will we be making adjustments to bring those targets in line? Absolutely. There are several things that sort of come forward with like biochem, because you can see it on the trainer, you can see the advantage immediately. Some things like armor mech and stuff like that is a little bit more hidden. And is that necessarily good? No, but you can get drops in recipes, you can get augments, and you can end up getting your sort of top end gear even more customized than some of the other people. So there's different things like that we're toying with, but the target is to have all of them equally viable within the end game content.
Excellent. Now, when it comes to endgame, the player base has, I suppose, different goals. But when it comes to high-end endgame play, in terms of, we can use the generic term here, raiding. For those of you who don't know, that's, of course, operations within the Old Republic. The aim seems to be to get the best gear available. The question, I suppose, then has to be asked, how does that mesh with the idea of an MMO that focuses on character development and storytelling? Can you convince those players that the story, once they've reached level 50 and they don't need to get any more experience and therefore they don't need to quest anymore, is actually important enough to do without dangling these big shiny rewards in front of them? Or are they always going to need that kind of incentive? Will any part of the additional story that you tell always have to have a better item to keep them going for it?
Well, I mean, I think just inherent to RPG, it's not even MMO, it's not, I mean, it's RPG. You go all the way back to Dungeons and Dragons, it's about getting the next items. I mean, that's an inherent part to it. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive by any means. Like the legacy system that we've talked a little bit about, it's going to encourage sort of like the families of players, if you will, experiencing some of the other stories, experiencing stories in different ways. And then also with our content updates that we're doing regularly, there's going to be the continuation of stories. Like Karaga's Palace, for example, is this sort of beginning teaser of a story arc that'll be stretching across several updates that kind of all of the players' stories have funneled into. The kind of the vacuum. Well, spoiler alert. Should I say spoilers or what?
Well, you've put out a spoiler alert. I'll put a little annotation on the video so they can skip it. So by all means, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, so spoiler alert. Sort of the power vacuum that's left after the Empire and Republic conflict at the end, towards the end of the players' stories, is trying to be filled by various factions. And the Hutt cartel is working with another group, and that's revealed in Karaga's Palace, and that's going to be part of that kind of vacuum of power story arc that goes on for some time. So we're always focusing on continuing the story. As far as the carrots, if you will, go, the different items, I mean, it's an inherent part to RPGs, so it's like we're not going to alienate that either. That's going to be there as well. So not mutually exclusive, hand in hand.
Ladies and gentlemen, Gabe from BioWare, thank you very much for coming on the show today, and we'll bring you more tour content as good content presents itself to be shown. My name has been Totalbiscuit, and I will see you next time.